I guess it was only a matter of time. I finally know what it feels like to have a rib injury from jiu-jitsu. I feel like it's a rite of passage, honestly. But seriously, this is no joke. And since the injury only happened a week ago, I plan on taking you guys with me on my recovery. Now in this first video, I'm going to include my self-assessment, diagnosis, and then rehab exercises. And the following videos will show my exercise and rehab progressions, along with how I progressed back into jiu-jitsu. So, how it all happened. So sadly, I didn't get the footage on video, so we'll have to settle for a video that best reenacts what happened. So I was in keiso gatame, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the jiu-jitsu terms or that position, it's the guy that's on the top in this video. So I was in this position and I was trying to isolate my opponent's arm. But as I was doing this, he was able to shift my weight just enough and he rolled me over. And as he was rolling me over, instead of letting go and accepting the loss of position, I held on for too long and rolled over onto my own arm. And as he rolled over top of me, that's when I felt the pop. Now, immediately after this, I laid on my back for like 2 to 3 minutes, and I tried to let the pain settle down so I could get a grasp of exactly where it was. And every time I tried to take a deep breath, the pain would stop me, which had me worried that I may have fractured the rib. And as I tried to sit up, I couldn't sit straight up, so I had to very slowly roll over onto my stomach and get on all fours and push myself up into the standing position. And at this point, every movement hurt no matter what I did. So I packed up my bags and went home, and then I made a huge mistake. I tried to return to the position where I was lying on my back on the floor. And it literally took me about 3 minutes to get up from that position. Now, after the fact I realized why this happened, it's because the floor was much harder than the mats at the gym, and it was a little bit more compliant and let my ribs move. And finally, I was able to stand up. And at this point, it was about an hour and a half after the injury. So these were my initial thoughts. So the very first thing I wanted to make sure of, which is why I stayed on the ground for a while after the injury, was that I didn't have a punctured lung. This is one of the first red flags to clear directly after a rib injury. And this definitely would have been noticeable way before an hour and a half later, so I was in the clear for that. The second was a liver laceration. Now, even though the mechanism for a liver laceration is really severe, as the rib has to really dive deep in order to get to that level, this was still on the table, as the effects of a slow bleed of the liver can be delayed. But at this point, I didn't have any signs of nausea or shock, so I didn't feel like this was the case. Now the third was a rib fracture. This seemed way more likely given the mechanism of injury, but if I really slowed down my breathing, I was able to inhale moderately well. And I was also able to raise both of my arms over my head with minimal pain. So the rib fracture became less likely. Now, the fourth differential diagnosis, and what ended up being my working diagnosis, was a costochondral separation. So much like the cartilage in the nose that can be separated from the nasal bone, the ribs have cartilage that extend from the end of some of the ribs to the rib above it, or that attach to the sternum. So a costochondral separation, costo meaning rib and chondral meaning cartilage, is just a separation, full or partial, of that junction. Now this would explain my symptoms pretty well, and it's also consistent with the mechanism of injury. So I'm breaking my limitations down into 4 categories: trunk range of motion, stability, running tolerance, and jiu-jitsu. So about 24 hours after the injury, my resting pain was at about a 2 out of 10. And I still had really sharp pains whenever I sneezed, coughed, or breathed in really deeply. I had an absolutely horrible night of sleep due to the fact that I couldn't find a comfortable position to lay in. So that sucked. My trunk range of motion deficits were consistent with my original diagnosis, given the musculature that attaches in that region, including the muscles like the intercostals, the external oblique, the rectus abdominis, internal oblique, and transverse abdominis. Now it's hard to tell this acutely what ribs specifically were affected, but as the pain calmed down over the next 48 hours, it was a little bit easier to pinpoint, and we'll go over that a little bit later. It doesn't really matter that much because the rehab for it won't change, but I still like to try and figure it out. So even sitting here in a slouch position kind of sucks. All right. Okay, now stability deficits were much more glaring, and it was not surprising to me at all that I couldn't get into a full right-sided plank position, given that these trunk muscles are most active in this position. The pain was around a 6 out of 10 whenever I tried to hold it in the same position as the left-sided plank, so I had to stick with right-sided planks from the knees for now. Anti-rotation was significantly harder when I was resisting left rotation, which clarified for me that the external oblique was heavily involved, since its responsibility is to rotate the trunk to the opposite side, and since it attaches on the inferior borders of those lower 8 ribs. Bracing with the hip hinge was painful about 3/4 of the way down, likely due to compressive forces, and that was with me only holding a 15-pound medicine ball. Now, running was an immediate no-go, as every time my foot hit the ground, right or left, it triggered about a 5 to 6 out of 10 pain, and I just felt like that was a little bit too much pain to try to work into this early on. As far as jiu-jitsu goes, I chose not to go back to the gym for a week and maybe do some light drilling if the pain got better. So I chose to test all of these movements very early on, because simply resting and not moving is not going to be ideal, especially in a situation where there's no fracture. Now, if I did suspect that I had a fracture, this would not be the course of treatment. So if this happens to you and your symptoms are much more severe than mine, be safe and go pursue getting an x-ray. If you're interested in what to do after you have an actual rib fracture, let me know down below in the comments and I'll make a separate video for that. But for costochondral pathologies like this one, finding a baseline level of tolerance for movement at the very beginning is important so that you do enough to maintain the function that you do have while you're promoting healing in the areas that have been affected. Resting alone will not allow this to happen. It'll only stiffen you up more. So starting the following day, I performed thoracic range of motion in the exact same way that I had tested it, going slightly into the discomfort and back out, and taking note of the progress from day to day. And for stability, I did the same exact thing, performing isometric trunk stability exercises, modifying the less tolerable ones as necessary. So my aerobic work for the week, I got on the bike and took it easy. And for jiu-jitsu, I was able to do some really slow shrimping, working very slowly through the movement so that I could feel what parts of the movement were the most painful. And here's a list of the exercises I did daily up until this point. And I was able to progress all of these movements by the end of the week, so make sure you stick around for the second video to see how I progressed. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.